By learning about sewing tools and materials in the beginning, you'll feel more prepared and confident when we talk about them later in each lesson. Having the right tools for any job will not only make your task easier, your experience will be more enjoyable, which will allow your creativity to develop and grow. I want these tools to become an extension of your hands so that you don't have to think about how to use them as you're designing and creating. Before we get started, I want to make sure you know exactly what tools and materials you're going to need before you start each project, where to get them, and the purpose for each item. Sewing tools are the things that you'll only need to purchase once and should last you several years if you buy good quality ones. Sewing materials are the things that will get used up as you work on your projects. There are just a few must-have tools for hand sewing. If you take good care of them, they'll last you a good long time. The longer you sew and the more you use these tools, the more they'll seem like old friends fitting naturally in your hands as you work and stitch and design. There's a list of all my favorite tools and materials in the course guide that you can reference while you're purchasing your tools. Probably the most important thing you'll need for hand sewing is a needle. Hand sewing needles have 3 parts: the eye, which is the hole on top that the thread goes through, the shaft, which is the part that you hold on to, and the point, which is the part that you poke into the fabric. There are lots of different kinds of needles, each one made for a specific purpose. During this course, we're going to use 2 different types of needles: a chenille needle, which is also called an embroidery needle, and a sharp, which is just your basic sewing needle. So later in the course, when I say you'll need your sharp needle, I don't mean just any sharp needle. I mean the needle that's called a sharp. Needle sizes range from big to small and everything in between. The larger the number, the smaller the needle, and the smaller the number, the larger the needle, which seems kind of backwards to me, but that's the way they do it. Smaller needles work best with finer fabrics, and the larger needles work best for heavier fabrics. To me, a shorter needle feels a little bit more like an extension of your hand, and a longer needle feels a little bit more like you're using a tool. Let's go ahead and take a look at the difference between a chenille needle and a sharp needle. A chenille needle has a little bit of a larger eye, which is great for fitting embroidery floss through. It has a little bit of a thicker shaft and is perfect for working through fabrics like felt, which is what we'll be using in the beginning. A size 20 or 22 is a great size to start with. A sharp is your everyday ordinary sewing needle. You can see the eye is a little bit smaller and the shaft is a little bit skinnier. We'll be using a sharp on projects where we're using regular sewing thread and regular fabric. A great size of a sharp to start with will be an 8 or a 10. I really think it's worth it to spend a couple bucks more and buy a good quality needle and the right size for the fabric you're working on. You'll just be less frustrated and happier the way your projects turn out if you use the right size. One of our projects will be to make a needle book so that you can keep all your favorite needles in one place. You might think that 1 pair of scissors is all you need for hand sewing, but you will for sure need at least 2, and 3 is even better. The 2 kinds that you will absolutely have to have are your fabric scissors and your paper scissors, but it's nice to have a small pair of scissors for clipping thread too. Any pair of scissors you have laying around the house that cut paper are great for cutting out your patterns. They just need to be able to slice through a piece of paper. You'll need fabric scissors for cutting felt and fabric. If you use your fabric scissors on paper, they'll get dull pretty quickly, and then they won't cut fabric anymore. There's nothing more frustrating than trying to cut fabric with a pair of dull scissors. So I would say buy a brand new pair of scissors and then use them for only cutting fabric, and then keep them in a safe place so that no one accidentally uses them on paper or anything else. And even better, tie a ribbon or something around them so that everybody knows that these are your sewing only scissors. A nice pair of fabric scissors should slice easily through felt and fabric and not be frustrating to you at all. Let me show you what happens if you try to use a pair of paper scissors on felt. And that is no fun. So make sure you get a nice pair of fabric scissors. It's great to have a little pair of scissors on hand as well, so that when you get to the end of your stitching row, you can just clip that thread with a small pair of scissors. If they're sharp enough to cut through felt, that's even better, because a lot of our pattern pieces are on the small side, and these little scissors just maneuver around those pieces easier than a large pair. Pins are used to hold fabric layers together and keeps them from shifting around while you're trying to sew. We'll be using pins on almost every sewing project. When we're using pins, there's a couple different things you need to keep in mind. When we're lining edges of fabric up together like this, and we want to keep them pinned together so that as we're sewing, the pieces don't move around, we want to insert the pin from the edge toward the middle of the fabric with the head on the outside and the point in the middle. Another way we'll be using pins is when we pin a smaller piece of fabric to a larger piece. And in this case, we'll be placing the pin from top to bottom with the head on the top and the point facing down. Exact measurements are really important in sewing, so we'll be needing a good measuring tool. A seam gauge is a small 6-inch ruler with a sliding piece that helps mark specific measurements if we need to take note of those on a piece of fabric. There are so many different types of marking tools to choose from, but I think that this one fits the bill best for what we'll be doing. The Pilot friction pen is my favorite because it's black, so it shows up on most fabrics. It writes easily, and then when you're all done stitching, you just hit it with a warm iron and that mark erases away. A thimble is a tiny tool that protects your finger when pushing the needle through the fabric. They come in different materials like metal, plastic, rubber, and leather. It should fit comfortably on your middle finger. You might feel like you don't need to use a thimble if you're sewing along comfortably with no problems. But if you start to notice that the pad of your middle finger is getting sore, or you're noticing little poke marks on it, then it's probably time to start using a thimble. It might feel a little bit awkward at first and takes a little bit of getting used to. So it might be easiest to learn the basics of hand sewing, and then once you're pretty comfortable with the needle, thread, and fabric, then try using a thimble. My favorite thimble to use would be a leather thimble. It fits easily on your finger, and then once you use it for just a little while, it conforms to your finger and you can't even feel it anymore. My second choice would be a thimble that has grippy sides. It also sticks to your finger well and won't come flying off while you're doing your stitching. Metal and plastic thimbles tend to fall off while you're sewing, so these are my top two choices. Using beeswax is a good way to condition your sewing thread to keep it from twisting and tangling as you sew. It also coats it to keep it from getting frayed as you pull it through the fabric over and over. Beeswax comes in a cake, and the way you use it is you just hold your piece of sewing thread to the cake with your thumb and you run the thread through, and that just puts a nice coating on your thread so that it makes it easier to handle as you're pulling it through the fabric. Now we only use the beeswax on our sewing thread and not our embroidery floss. You'll need an iron and an ironing board or mat for our last few lessons. It's a good idea to make sure that all of your fabrics are wrinkle-free before we start any project, but we'll be using an iron consistently near the end of our course. A mini or a craft iron is nice for small projects, but a big iron works just as well if that's what you have. I like to use an ironing mat for working on these projects because it fits on a table or a desk, but an ironing board works just as well too. Each project we work on will have its own set of materials. The list for this course isn't long, but you will need several colors of certain materials like felt and embroidery floss, for example. Check out the materials list in the course guide for a breakdown of all the materials that you'll need for every project before you get started. It'll be a time saver to take the list and get everything you need all at once. And just a heads up, most of the projects require little amounts of felt or fabric, so you won't have to buy very much. To source the materials, you can either reference the materials list in the course guide and match the colors to the project photos, or you may just choose to pick out your own colors for the projects. For more detailed information about how to obtain your tools and materials for this course, check out the Tools and Materials section in the course guide. You'll need a pattern anytime you're doing a project. Think of it like a blueprint. It'll give you exact instructions to make sure that your project comes together perfectly. The first thing you'll need to do when you print out your pattern is measure your test square to make sure it measures 1 inch. That will ensure that your pattern is the correct size before you begin. There's also a reference template on the side that will give you an example of what it looks like when it's all done. The stitching is just there for a reference. That doesn't mean that your stitching needs to match it exactly. On each pattern piece, there's a name of what the piece is and how many of each to cut out. So make sure you take note of all the things before you cut them out. To me, picking out the fabric is one of the most exciting parts of planning a project. We'll be using felt for the first few projects, and then we'll move on to cotton and linen in later lessons. These fabrics are all easy to handle and are great to learn on. The first fabric we'll be starting with is felt. Felt is really easy to handle and holds stitches well. It's made up either of a synthetic wool blend, or pure wool, but a synthetic or a blend is great for what we'll be doing. Later on, we'll be using either cotton or linen, and they can be used interchangeably. Cotton is going to be easier for you to find, it's a little bit less expensive, and it has a tighter weave. Linen has a little bit of a looser weave, will be a little bit more difficult to find, and is a little bit more expensive, but either one works just as well, and they're both made up of natural fibers. We'll be using 2 different types of thread during this course. All-purpose sewing thread, which is great for most basic sewing projects, and embroidery floss, which is great for decorative stitching. We'll start with embroidery floss because we'll mainly be learning embroidery stitches in the beginning. Embroidery floss is thicker, but can be separated into smaller strands for variation. Sewing thread comes in a single strand, is stronger, and is used for sewing fabric together. The first type of thread we'll be using is called embroidery floss. It comes in a skein, and its thread is made up of 6 individual pieces, which can be separated for variation. The second type of thread we'll be using is just your basic everyday sewing thread. It comes on a spool and is just a single strand, but is stronger and is meant for sewing pieces of fabric together. If you want to choose your own colors for some of the projects, here are a few tips to help you pick out colors that go well together. A good rule of thumb when choosing colors is to use the color wheel. You're probably already familiar with the color wheel, but here's a quick recap just in case. A basic color wheel has primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, secondary colors, green, orange, and purple, and tertiary colors, which are a blend of primary and secondary colors. You can use colors that are next to each other or across from each other on the color wheel to help you choose harmonies that work well together. You can play with different color combinations to see what you like. Are you drawn to warm colors or cool colors? Do you want to produce a calming mood or an energetic one? Do you like the colors that you find in the forest or in the ocean or the desert? You just can't go wrong using nature as a guide. You could also try looking for inspiration from other color palettes you see, like on a billboard or a book jacket or even a sweatshirt. I like to take photos of color combinations that speak to me that I think I might want to use in a project later on. You can take a picture or keep a creative inspiration journal to help you during the times you're feeling kind of stuck. The success of any job, hobby, or project depends on having the right tools and materials and knowing how everything works together to get the result that you've imagined. Now that we've laid a good foundation, you're ready to start creating.